Hiya! Welcome! So this is a response to a thread started by a great channel here in the YouTube vinyl community. I'm talking about Adam at What the Gym. A couple of weeks ago or so, he started a thread, a video thread here on YouTube, asking people questions relating to music in the 60s and 70s. And I really like this, I enjoyed his video. Of course, I'll leave a link to Adam's video at the very top of the description, so please, if you're interested in doing a video as a response to this like I am today, then click on Adam's video first, give it a watch, give him a sub as well, of course. I love What the Gym's content. For a young lad his age, he's really passionate about music, particularly 60s and 70s music. So I think it was inevitable that he would want to start a thread about 60s and 70s music at some point. So here are my responses to Adam. He set 10 questions or 10 prompts, but it's really 5 for the 60s and then the same repeated for the 1970s. Some of these I had trouble thinking because they were quite difficult for me to really decide on, but I'll get going. And the first 5 questions or prompts are to do with the 1960s, and Adam's first question is, if you could travel back in time and see a 60s band or artist in concert, then who would it be? The obvious answer for a lot of people, and I think was probably Adam's answer as well if my memory serves, was the Beatles. Now, for me, the Beatles, their era of when they started releasing more interesting music, to me personally, they'd stopped touring and they'd stopped playing live about a year before that, really, maybe a bit less than a year. From Revolver onwards, they certainly weren't touring by then. You know, they only played live on very special occasions, such as the Apple rooftop gig in '69, the One World concert in '67, etc. I'm going to pick Pink Floyd for this because they started around '67 and they were just a really interesting live band because, and you can see certain clips on YouTube as well, they had all the light shows and the real trippy psychedelia. I am a Pink Floyd fan, I'm collecting their albums slowly at the moment. And also, I thought it was quite nice to pick those, as my dad actually did see Pink Floyd in our hometown Chesterfield in 1969. They played a venue that's been long since demolished, St James's Hall. It was not too long after Dave Gilmour joined Pink Floyd. He sort of replaced Syd Barrett. He kind of worked alongside Syd to start with and then properly replaced him later. To be at that gig would have been incredible. Just to think of a band like arguably the biggest band in the world of the last 50, 60 years nearly, having played my relatively little hometown of Chesterfield. But yeah, Pink Floyd did play there and my dad was at the show. Number 2, favourite 60s song. Now, it was a toss-up here, but I had to pick the one that I can actually show you a physical example for. And this is Je t'aime moi non plus by Jane Birkin and Serge Gainsbourg. I absolutely adore this. I've loved this ever since I first heard it as a kid. I think one of my mum and dad's favourites as well over the years. Just the epitome of French pop, really. And I think it's still, from the best of my knowledge, the only purely foreign language single that's ever got to number 1 in the UK. There's been other singles since that have had foreign language, non-English I should say, in the song, but it's been kind of mixed with English as well, whereas this is just all French. And I said this was a toss-up because a very, very close second for me was The Mighty Quinn by Manfred Mann, another one I absolutely adore. But I had to pick this one really, as I could actually show you the 7-inch single of Je t'aime by Jane Birkin and Serge Gainsbourg. And yes, I know Mighty Quinn was originally by Bob Dylan. I don't actually like Bob Dylan's original version, to be honest. I've heard it and I wasn't that bothered. But Manfred Mann's I think is absolutely amazing. But this magnificent Je t'aime is my favourite song of the 1960s. Number 3, Adam asked to show a 60s album, a 60s record or CD. Now, I couldn't go throughout this video without showing anything by the Beatles, even though they seem the obvious answer for a lot of these 60s questions. I did want to try and mix it up a bit, and this is going to be my Beatles answer for this thread. I'm going to pick Abbey Road simply because it's my favourite Beatles album here. I could have shown a lot of Beatles, obviously I've got every album they've done, and I've also got certain other albums from the 1960s, but why not show my very favourite, and I think it's Adam's favourite, and probably a lot of other people's as well, from 1969. Technically the final studio album, even though Let It Be came out afterwards. A, that came out in the early 1970s, so for me it wouldn't qualify for this question, and B, this was recorded after that anyway. Abbey Road is an album from the 60s. Let's get these questions back up. Question 4 is, if you could meet any solo music artist of the 60s, then who would it be? Now then, when Adam says solo music artist, I think that will include members of bands. I think he just means if you could meet like one person who was a musician or a singer, rather than someone who has to be a solo artist who wasn't in a band. That's how I'm interpreting it anyway, and I'm sure Adam won't mind that you interpret these questions the way that you wish to, really. I struggled with this one because there's so many people from that era. You know, obviously meeting any of the Beatles would be absolutely incredible. I thought, you know, possibly to meet Syd Barrett would be interesting, but I think the one I'm going to choose, and it's an artist who I don't really collect in, I have got one of her singles, I just don't know what to do with myself, which is a fantastic track. Another one that would be my top 10 of the entire decade, I think. I'm going to go with Dusty Springfield. I just would like to meet her. She always seemed like a classy lady, a great voice. She's someone I probably should get more of her back catalogue, really. Just one 7-inch single is probably not enough for any self-respecting music fan. Although I do, of course, have her duet with Pet Shop Boys that came out in the late 80s, What Have I Done to Deserve This? So I do actually have more Dusty in my collection, but it's a Pet Shop Boys thing first and foremost. So yeah, Dusty Springfield, I would just like to have met her. I probably would have liked to see her in concert really as well. I think if you saw someone like that in concert, you just want to buy their album straight after really. But I'm picking Dusty for number 4 here. And the final question for the 60s section of the thread is your favourite year of music from the decade. I think for me, I'm going to have to pick, not just because of the music, but because of the whole sort of counterculture and just everything that was happening in the world at the time. I think I'm going to have to pick 1967. Because 67, really, when you watch back these retrospectives and documentaries about the decade of the 60s, 67 always seems to be one where a lot's happening. Of course, Beatles released Sgt. Pepper in 1967, and then towards the end of the year, the Magical Mystery Tour movie and double EP. And then you've got other things like The Summer of Love was 1967, the height of hippie culture really. I think just to have lived in that year and to experience it as, you know, an adult or even sort of like a teenager would have been absolutely incredible really. And there's been some great music that came out in 1967, so that's the year I'm going to pick for that. So we can move on to the 70s questions, all the same questions, just relating to the 1970s. So question 6, or question 1 in this part, is if you could travel back in time and see a 70s band or artist, who would it be? I almost picked Joy Division for this. Joy Division, of course, formed in the late 70s. They were sort of on the back of punk, really, being post-punk, leading into new wave. But then I thought, no, I won't pick Joy Division because it's kind of like I've almost seen them live, weirdly, anyway, because Bernard Sumner and Stephen Morris from Joy Division, of course, seen New Order live in concert, and Peter Hook, who was in New Order, I've seen him in concert a few times now, actually, as part of Monaco. And of course Peter Hook and the Light. So I'm going to go with the Sex Pistols because that would just be an absolutely anarchic experience, wouldn't it? And I think for me particularly it'd have to be either the Sex Pistols when they were first starting, like the really early days when they were just getting established and punk was barely even a thing, or the very end of the Sex Pistols' tenure as a touring act, where Sid Vicious had no real capability of playing live, and John Lydon, Johnny Rotten, as I suppose he still would have been back then, was absolutely fed up of being in the band. And there was the famous final gig in America, I can't remember the venue offhand, but a lot of you will know it. And he just ends the gig and ends his tenure in the Sex Pistols with the line, "Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?" So that would have been an interesting concert to be at, so I will pick the Sex Pistols for that one. Number 2, favourite 70s song. I really struggled with this. The 70s isn't much my era really, apart from one or two acts such as Joy Division, the Sex Pistols I'm a fan of, Pink Floyd, although I talked about Pink Floyd in the 60s bit because that's when they first formed. There's loads of absolutely amazing songs that was released in that decade. You know, some would argue it was probably the best decade for songs out of them all, the 1970s. But I think today, and this will probably be something that will change for me, I might decide on something else if you ask me a week later, but because I bought the album recently, very recently actually, I showed it on the last Records Roundup that I did a few days ago. I'm going to pick the title track from Wish You Were Here by Pink Floyd. I listened to that album the other day. Such a great album actually. It's got to be up there as one of my very favourite Pink Floyd albums. I think if I listen to it more and more, it might actually become my very favourite. But the title track, Wish You Were Here, if you listen to it, it's like the perfect single, really, from a band who didn't release it as a single. It's a beautiful, acoustic-driven pop song, almost. You know, it's weird to say the word pop and Pink Floyd in the same sentence, but that's about as poppy for me as Pink Floyd ever got, while still retaining that great level of quality musicianship that Pink Floyd were renowned for during the 70s. I think if that had been released as a single, it would have done really well, but Pink Floyd, as you know, particularly here in the UK, they weren't that keen on releasing singles, although ironically it got to the end of 79 and then Another Brick in the Wall became Christmas #1, so just goes to show that maybe they should have been releasing a few more singles all along. But my pick for, at the moment anyway, and I wouldn't say it may stay my favourite song of the 70s, but will always be there in my top 10, is Wish You Were Here by Pink Floyd. Question 3 is to show a 70s album on LP or CD. I'm going to do neither. I'm sure Adam won't mind, but I always enjoy these threads as there's an excuse to get my mini disc collection shown a little bit again. So I'm going to show an album on mini disc. I'm going to show from 1977 the self-titled debut album of The Clash. I've got all of The Clash's albums on mini disc that came out on MD. There's one from the mid-80s, I think, Cut the Crap, that I've got on CD because that never got an MD release. Not my favourite Clash album, but a great one nonetheless. I need to listen to my Clash albums again pretty soon actually and really determine a better ranking for them, to be honest, because it's been a while. I could have picked any of the Clash's first, I think, 3 albums that came out in the 70s, and then Sandinista was 1980, I think, so that wouldn't have qualified, but I thought because it's the debut, it's got an iconic sleeve, it's got a nice hype sticker on it, I'll just show you The Clash by The Clash. The 4th question, or the 9th question in the 70s section of the thread is if you could meet any music artist from the decade, who would it be? For me, it would be Ian Curtis from Joy Division. He was someone who died way too young, took his own life in 1980. Joy Division had released only 2 albums. They were on the verge of being massive, really, Joy Division. Ian Curtis, I have seen interviews and heard interviews from him, but he was someone who, there's not a lot of kind of archive footage of him talking out there. I think that adds to the whole mystique of him that's kind of built up over the last 40 odd years, really. That we never really got to hear what was going on inside his head, and obviously there's a lot going on in his head, really. He certainly had mental health problems. He suffered with epilepsy. He had quite a notorious extramarital affair, so he had a lot going on for a young guy, really, and it all got on top of him by the spring of 1980, really. But just to be able to meet him and talk to him, really, and just trying to find out a little more about him, I think would be, for me, utterly fascinating. The final question is the favourite year of music for the 1970s. There again, because the 70s, I wouldn't say I'm a massive fan across the board. It's a tricky one, this. I'm going to go with, I think, 1979, simply because I love the 80s, and what you get before the decade of the 80s, you get 1979. So that's really, for me, where everything's coming together. I mean, Joy Division had released Unknown Pleasures. There were lots of other bands who would go on to bigger things in the 80s, really getting established by this late point in the decade. The Jam, The Police, etc. Not bands I'm a massive fan of, but you know, certain songs of theirs I do like. But I think just because it's the gateway to the 80s, where music really branched off into multiple different genres and scenes, I think I've got to pick 1979 really. So that is my response to the thread started by Adam at What the Gym relating 60s and 70s music. Thank you all for watching this. Thank you to Adam for starting the thread. Hope you all enjoyed this. I want to say special thanks not only to What the Gym for starting this, but also of course my subscribers and generous patrons. Please see my Patreon link, Facebook group link and other interesting referral links down in the description text box. And of course a reminder to go and give What the Gym a sub. His link for his original thread video is at the top of that description. I'm gonna go now, maybe put The Clash by The Clash on. Haven't heard this in a long time, but then I've heard this plenty of times and I always love it. Abbey Road by the Beatles. Or, if I've only got a few minutes to spare, the best single of the 60s, Je T'aime, Jane Birkin, Serge Gainsbourg. Why not? And I do hope that all of you will join me again next time for my next vinyl community video. Cheers everyone. See ya!